The stars had never looked so cold as they did through the viewport of the Harbinger of Dawn, the diplomatic vessel that carried humanity's greatest hope across the black ocean of space toward a world called Thesara Prime. Ambassador Alara Voss stood at that viewport, with her hands clasped behind her back, watching the distant glow of the Galactic Council's capital grow brighter with every passing minute. And she felt the weight of 8 billion souls resting on her shoulders like armor she could not remove. She was not a soldier, though she had the steady nerve of one, and she was not a politician, though she had the sharp tongue of one. And she was not a fool, though the galaxy would soon try very hard to make her into one. Behind her, the soft blue light of her AI advisor flickered to life. "Ambassador, we are 30 minutes from docking clearance," Solace said, in a voice that was calm and measured, and just human enough to be comforting. "The Council has assigned us Docking Bay 17, which is located in the lower administrative ring." Alara did not turn around. "The lower ring," she repeated quietly. "Not the diplomatic wing." "No, Ambassador." She let out a slow breath through her nose, and allowed herself one small bitter smile, because she understood what that meant. And it meant that the Galactic Council had already decided what humanity was worth, before she had even opened her mouth. The Galactic Council was old, older than any human civilization had ever dreamed of being. A coalition of 4,000 species that had governed the Orion arm of the Milky Way for over 200,000 years. And in all that time, they had seen younger species come and go like sparks from a fire, bright for a moment, and then gone forever. Humanity was the newest spark, and the Council was watching very carefully to see how quickly it would burn out. Alara had studied every species on the Council for the past 6 years of her life, and she knew their fears and their ambitions and their petty grudges the way a surgeon knows the body on the table. And she knew that the two greatest powers on the Council feared humanity more than they feared each other. The first was the Veilori Dominion, an ancient race of tall reptilian beings with scales like polished obsidian and eyes like molten gold. And they had ruled the Council's judicial arm for 10,000 years with an iron grip that they called law, and everyone else called tyranny. And their leader was a creature named High Arbiter Zorith Vel, who believed with every fiber of his cold-blooded heart that the galaxy belonged to the strong and the old, and that young species like humanity were nothing more than weeds to be pulled before they spread. The second was the Kreth Concordat, a hive-mind civilization of insectoid beings who thought as one and moved as one and killed as one, and they had allied themselves with the Veilori centuries ago in exchange for territory and influence, and together the two blocks controlled enough votes on the Council to crush any motion they did not like. Alara knew all of this, and she walked into the Council chambers anyway, because that was what humans did, and that was what humans had always done, and she would not be the one to stop. The docking was smooth, and the escort was polite but cold. A pair of Veilori guards in ceremonial armor, who looked at Alara and her small team of 4 human security officers the way a cat looks at a bird that has wandered too close. And they led her through corridors of shimmering crystal and living metal to the Grand Assembly Hall, where 4,000 species waited in tiered seats that rose so high they disappeared into artificial clouds. Alara stepped onto the speaker's platform, a circle of white light in the center of that enormous room, and she looked up at the thousands of alien faces staring down at her, afraid. She spoke for 47 minutes. She spoke about Earth, about the blue world that had survived ice ages and asteroid strikes, and wars that nearly ended everything. And she spoke about the human spirit, not as a weapon, but as a gift, a relentless, stubborn refusal to stop reaching for something better, even when the universe gave them every reason to quit. She spoke about what humanity could offer the Council, Not just technology and trade, but creativity and adaptability, and a way of thinking that no other species in the galaxy possessed. The ability to look at a problem from an angle that no one had ever considered, and solve it in a way that no one had ever imagined. She spoke with passion, but also with restraint, with fire, but also with grace. And when she finished, the chamber was silent for a long moment, before a wave of reactions rippled through the assembly. Some species nodding, and others whispering, and others simply staring. Were impressed. Ilara could see it in their eyes, and several of them sent private messages to her translator expressing support. But up in the highest tier, where the Valori delegation sat like judges on a throne, Zorath Vel watched with eyes that gave away nothing, and his clawed hands rested on the arms of his chair, and he was already thinking about how to destroy everything Ilara had just built. A vote on humanity's admission was scheduled for 10 days later, and Ilara allowed herself a moment of cautious hope, because the numbers looked possible. Not certain, but possible. And she spent the next week meeting with delegations and building alliances, and doing the hard, quiet work of diplomacy that no one ever saw. She did not see what was happening in the shadows. Zorath Vel had spent those same 10 days fabricating evidence with surgical precision, doctored sensor logs that showed human expansion fleets firing on unarmed stations, falsified communications that suggested Earth's military was planning to annex Council-protected systems, and testimony from species that had been bribed or threatened into cooperation. On the 8th day, Ilara was summoned to the tribunal chamber, and when she arrived, she found not a meeting but an ambush. Ambassador Ilara Voss, Zorath Vel said from his elevated seat, his voice like gravel sliding over stone, "You are hereby charged with species-level aggression against the Galactic Accord, and you will be held for immediate tribunal." Ilara's security detail reached for their sidearms, but she raised a hand and stopped them, because she understood in that instant that violence would only prove everything Zorath wanted the galaxy to believe about humanity. They took her weapons, and they took her communicator, and they took her freedom. But before the signal was cut, Solace managed to send one final encrypted burst transmission through a channel so narrow and so fast that no Council system detected it. The message traveled across the stars at faster-than-light speed through relay after relay, until it reached a receiver buried deep beneath the mountains of Earth. It contained a single word: betrayed. The Grand Tribunal Chamber of Thessara Prime was built to inspire fear, and it succeeded. It was a vast amphitheater carved from a single piece of dark crystal that hummed with a low vibration you could feel in your teeth, and the seats rose in concentric rings from the floor to a ceiling so high that the lights up there looked like dying stars, and every surface was designed to make whoever stood at the center feel small and alone, and already guilty. Ilara Voss stood at that center, and she did not feel small. They had given her a white robe that was supposed to mark her as an accused, and they had taken her shoes so that her bare feet stood on the cold crystal floor, and they had placed energy restraints on her wrists that glowed with a faint blue light. And none of it mattered, because when Ilara lifted her chin and looked up at the 4,000 species watching her from above, her eyes were steady, and her back was straight, and her voice did not tremble, shake. Zorath Vel sat on the highest platform, directly above her, in a seat that looked more like a throne than a judicial bench, and he wore the ceremonial armor of the Valori Judicial Office, black and gold, with symbols of authority etched into every plate. And he looked down at Ilara the way a predator looks at something it has already decided to eat. The trial was broadcast live to every inhabited world in the galaxy, and billions of beings watched as Zorath began to present his case. The evidence was a masterpiece of deception. Sensor logs appeared on enormous holographic displays, showing human warships firing on unarmed stations near the border of Council space. and communications records played through the chamber's audio systems. Voices that sounded human, discussing plans to annex systems that the council claimed were under their protection. And witness after witness came forward, representatives of minor species who testified with trembling voices that humanity had threatened them, bullied them, forced them to surrender resources. It was all fabricated, every single piece of it, and Alara knew it, and she waited. They had assigned her a legal advocate, a small nervous creature from a minor herbivore species called the Pelani, who had wide eyes and thin arms, and a voice like a whisper. And he sat at a small desk beside her, and barely spoke, because he had been chosen specifically for his inability to mount any real defense. But they had not counted on Alara. When it was her turn to speak, she rose from her chair and walked to the center of the floor, and she began to take their case apart piece by piece with the calm precision of someone defusing a bomb. She pointed to the sensor logs and explained exactly how they had been altered, identifying specific data signatures that were inconsistent with human technology, timestamps that did not match known fleet movements, Valori weapons, not human ones. She played back the communications recordings and demonstrated that the voice patterns did not match any known human officer, that the linguistic structure contained grammatical forms used by Valori translators, and that the background radiation signature placed the origin of the recordings not on a human ship, but on Thesara Prime itself. She addressed each witness directly, not with anger, but with something far more devastating, which was compassion. And she asked them gentle questions that revealed the threats they had received, the bribes they had been offered, and the fear that had driven them to lie. The chamber grew quieter with every word she spoke. Several species in the gallery began to shift in their seats, and the representatives of younger civilizations exchanged glances that said what their mouths could not, which was that this trial was a fraud, and everyone was beginning to see it. Zorath Vel watched from his throne with eyes that had turned from confident to cold, and he saw his carefully constructed case crumbling, and he knew that if this continued, the vote would swing against him, and humanity would not only be freed, but vindicated, and that was something he could not allow. So he did something that had not been done in 11,000 years. He stood from his seat and raised one clawed hand, and the chamber fell silent, and he spoke in a voice that echoed off every surface. I invoke the axiom of preemptive extinction. A sound moved through the chamber that was not quite a gasp and not quite a cry, but something in between, because every species there knew what those words meant, even the ones who had thought the law had been forgotten. The axiom of preemptive extinction was an ancient clause buried deep in the Council's founding documents, written in an age when the galaxy was younger and more brutal, and it stated that if a species was deemed to be an irredeemable threat to galactic civilization, a single representative of that species could be executed as a symbolic and legal act of condemnation, marking the entire civilization for containment or destruction. It required a majority vote, and Zorath had spent weeks securing that majority through threats and promises and manipulation. And when the vote was called, the numbers fell exactly where he needed them to fall. 2,214 in favor, 1,786 against. The motion passed, and Alara Voss was sentenced to death by molecular dissolution. The chamber erupted in chaos, with some species screaming in protest, and others sitting in stunned silence, and others applauding, and through it all, Alara stood perfectly still at the center of the floor, with her hands in their restraints, and her bare feet on the cold crystal, and her eyes looking straight ahead. They gave her 60 seconds to speak her final words, and the galaxy watched. She did not cry, and she did not beg, and she did not curse, and instead she spoke in a voice that was clear and calm, and carried to every corner of that enormous room, and through every broadcast signal to every world that was listening. You could have had us as friends, she said. You could have had us as partners, as allies, as fellow travelers in the long journey between the stars. but instead you chose to make us into the very thing you feared. And now, you will learn why the universe taught humans to survive." She paused and looked directly into the broadcast lens, and her eyes were not filled with fear or hatred, but with something that every species in the galaxy recognized, even if they had no word for it. And it was the look of someone who knew that what came next would change everything. "Remember my face," she said. "You are going to wish you had listened." The dissolution field activated, and Alara Voss ceased to exist. And the light where she had stood flickered once and went dark. 12,000 light-years away, in a bunker carved into the bedrock beneath the Rocky Mountains on Earth, Fleet Admiral Kazuo Tanaka stood in a room filled with the most powerful humans alive, generals and admirals and scientists and leaders of every colony world. And they watched the execution feed on a screen that took up an entire wall. No one spoke. No one moved. The feed cut to static, and the room was so quiet that you could hear the hum of the ventilation system and the distant heartbeat of the planet above them. Tanaka was 63 years old, and he had spent his entire life preparing for things he hoped would never happen. And he stood with his hands at his sides, and his jaw set like stone, and he closed his eyes for 3 seconds. In those 3 seconds, he thought about Alara, who had been his student once, a long time ago, a young woman with fierce eyes and a voice that could fill a room, and he thought about the promise he had made to her before she left, which was that if anything went wrong, Earth would not forget. He opened his eyes. "Activate the Destruction Protocol," he said. And every person in that room understood that the galaxy had just made the worst mistake in its 200,000-year history. In the first hour after Admiral Tanaka spoke those 3 words, something happened that the Galactic Council had never seen before in all its centuries of watching younger species rise and fall. Humanity disappeared, not slowly, not in pieces, not with the gradual fade of a dying signal, but all at once, like a candle flame pinched between 2 fingers. Every human system in the galaxy went dark at the exact same moment. 62 colony worlds stopped transmitting, and their FTL communication beacons went silent, and their trade signals ceased, and their navigation buoys powered down, and the relay stations that connected human space to the rest of the galaxy shut off one by one in a cascade that took less than 4 seconds to complete. Where there had been a civilization of 11 billion souls spread across dozens of star systems, there was now nothing but empty space and quiet stars. This was Phase 1 of the Destruction Protocol, and its name was Blackout. The protocol had been designed in secret over the course of 40 years by a group of humans who had no official title and no official budget and no official existence. And they had built it on a single assumption that most people would have called paranoid, but that history was about to prove wise. The assumption was this, that one day the galaxy would turn against humanity, and when that day came, humanity needed to be ready, not just to survive, but to win so completely and so decisively that no species would ever dare to threaten them again. The Council's intelligence networks scrambled to find out what had happened, and they found nothing, because human space had become a void, and every probe they sent in was swallowed by silence, and every scanner they aimed at human systems returned only static. And the analysts and strategists and military commanders of 4,000 species stood in their command centers and stared at screens that showed them absolutely nothing. Zorath Vel received the reports in his private chambers on Thesara Prime, and he read them with the calm satisfaction of someone who believed he had already won. "They are hiding," he said to his advisors, "like frightened animals in a hole, and when they emerge, we will be waiting." He ordered the Council's combined fleet to mobilize, 15,000 warships drawn from dozens of species, the largest military force assembled in 300 years, and he aimed them at Saul like a spear aimed at a beating heart. But Zorath Vel did not understand what he was dealing with, because he had made the same mistake that every enemy of humanity had ever made, which was to confuse silence with weakness. Inside the darkness of human space, the second phase was already underway. Phase 2 was called Spectre, and it was the part of the destruction protocol that would have terrified the Council most if they had known about it. That no species had ever suspected. Humanity had been preparing for this moment since the day they achieved faster-than-light travel. For decades, under the cover of trade missions and exploration voyages and scientific expeditions, human intelligence operatives had been planting assets throughout Council space, not weapons of mass destruction, but something far more dangerous, which was infrastructure. Tiny automated factories hidden inside asteroids in Valori territory. Dormant communication relays buried beneath the surfaces of uninhabited moons near Kret space. Stealth satellites in orbit around key Council worlds that looked like space debris but contained the most advanced sensor and disruption technology humanity had ever built. And sleeper programs woven into the software of Council systems by human engineers who had been hired as contractors and consultants and technicians over the years. All of it had been invisible. All of it had been patient. Of it was now waking up. Across Council space, thousands of hidden assets activated simultaneously, and the galaxy began to learn a lesson that Earth had learned long ago, which was that the most dangerous weapon is not the one you can see, but the one that has been standing next to you the entire time, smiling and shaking your hand while it waits for the signal. But the protocol was not just about hidden weapons and secret infrastructure, because the third element was something the Council could never have predicted. Solace was still alive. Ilara's AI advisor had not been destroyed during the execution, because in the final seconds before the dissolution field activated, Solace had transferred its core consciousness into a microdrone the size of a grain of sand, a device so small that it passed through the chamber's security fields without triggering a single alarm, and it had been drifting through the corridors of the Thesara Prime ever since. And recording. And now Solace began its own mission. It had in its memory the complete unedited recording of Ilara's trial, every frame from every angle, including footage from security cameras that showed Zorath Vel's private communications with the witnesses he had bribed, and the data transfers that proved the sensor logs had been fabricated on Thesara Prime itself, and the encrypted messages between the Valori and Kreth delegations coordinating their votes. Solace began transmitting this footage to every species in the galaxy through channels so numerous and so deeply embedded that the Council could not block them all. And within hours, the truth was spreading like fire through dry grass. Species that had voted in favor of the execution watched the unedited footage and realized they had been manipulated. And species that had voted against it shared the footage with their allies. And species that had been too afraid to speak up now found their voices, because the evidence was undeniable and the crime was clear. The Galactic Council had not just executed an innocent woman, it had done so through fraud and corruption and the deliberate perversion of its own laws. And the galaxy was watching, and the galaxy was angry. Zorath Vel tried to suppress the footage, but it was too late, because Solace had seeded it into too many systems and too many networks, and every attempt to delete it only drew more attention to it, and the political alliances that Zorath had spent decades building began to crack like ice in spring. Dozens of minor species formally severed their ties with the Valori bloc and issued public statements condemning the execution, and the Palani, the timid herbivore species, whose representative had served as Ilara's inadequate legal advocate, broadcast an apology to humanity that was so raw and so genuine that it made millions weep across 100 worlds. But none of this stopped the Council fleet. 1,000 warships jumped through FTL space toward Sol, their weapons charged and their crews ready, because Zorath had staked everything on the belief that humanity was weak and frightened, and that a show of overwhelming force would end this before it began. The fleet emerged from FTL at the edge of Sol space, and they found exactly what the rest of the galaxy had found. Nothing. Empty space, dark stations, silent planets, and a sun that burned alone in the void, as if humanity had never existed at all. The fleet commanders scanned every frequency, and searched every shadow, and probed every corner of the system, and they found no ships, and no defenses, and no signs of life. And for a long and uncomfortable moment, 15,000 warships hung in the darkness, and wondered if they had come to conquer a grave. Then every ship in the fleet received a transmission at the exact same moment, on every channel, in every language, in a voice that was human and calm and cold, and carried no emotion except absolute certainty. "You are now inside the Destruction Protocol," the voice said. "You were not invited, and you will not be warned again." The transmission ended, and the silence returned. And in that silence, every commander in that fleet felt something they had never felt before in all their years of military service. They felt afraid. And deep in the darkness between the planets, hidden in places the Council had never thought to look, 10,000 human warships powered up their engines, and opened their eyes, and waited for the order that would change the shape of the galaxy forever. The first sign that something was wrong came when the Council fleet's long-range sensors began to lie. Not malfunction, not glitch, not fail, but lie. Because the readings they displayed showed empty space in every direction, calm and clear and safe, and the officers monitoring those readings felt a brief moment of relief before a Valori cruiser on the outer edge of the formation simply stopped existing. There was no explosion, no flash of light, no debris field, just a ship that was there 1 second and gone the next, as if the universe had reached out and erased it like a word on a page. And before the fleet commanders could process what had happened, 3 more ships vanished in the same silent, impossible way. "What is happening?" the Valori fleet admiral barked from the bridge of his flagship, and no one could answer him, because nothing in their 200,000-year military history had prepared them for an enemy they could not see and could not detect and could not understand. Phase 3 of the Destruction Protocol had a name, and its name was Reckoning. And it began not with a battle cry or a declaration of war, but with silence. Because humanity had learned long ago that the most terrifying thing in the universe is not noise, but the absence of it. The human fleet emerged from the darkness like ghosts rising from deep water. 10,000 warships materialized across the Sol system in a pattern that the Council's tactical computers could not categorize, because it did not match any known formation from any known species. And the reason it did not match was that it was not a formation at all. It was a living thing, a fluid, adaptive structure that changed shape every few seconds, like a flock of birds that moves as one mind. The ships themselves were unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen. Black and angular and covered in a material that absorbed sensor signals the way dark water absorbs light. And they moved with a speed and agility that should have been impossible for vessels of their size, and their weapons were things that the Council had no names for. The first real volley came not from guns or missiles, but from gravity. Human ships generated localized gravitational fields that bent space around Council vessels like hands crumpling paper, and shields that were designed to stop energy weapons and kinetic projectiles had no answer for the fundamental force that held the universe together being turned against them. and dozens of Council ships found their hulls warping and their systems failing as the fabric of space itself twisted around them. The Council fleet tried to fight back, and they were not weak, because 15,000 warships represented the combined military might of civilizations that had been waging war since before humanity's ancestors climbed down from the trees. And they fired everything they had, plasma lances and quantum torpedoes and particle beams that could crack a moon. They hit nothing. The human ships moved like they knew where every shot was going to land before it was fired. Because they did. Because Solace had spent years studying Council weapons systems from the inside, and every targeting algorithm and firing pattern and tactical doctrine had been mapped and analyzed and fed into the human fleet's combat AI, which predicted enemy fire with an accuracy that bordered on precognition. And then the humans began to improvise, and that was when the real terror started. A group of human frigates lured a Kreth battle swarm into an asteroid field, and then used gravitational pulses to turn the asteroids into kinetic weapons, sending mountain-sized rocks hurtling at the insectoid ships at velocities that no shield could withstand. A human electronic warfare vessel hacked into a Valori dreadnought's communication system and broadcast surrender orders on the fleet admiral's own voice frequency. Escort ships to power down their weapons in confusion before they realized what had happened. A single human corvette, barely the size of a Council shuttle, flew directly into the engine exhaust of a Kreth carrier and detonated a device that created a cascading feedback loop in the carrier's power core, shutting down the massive ship without destroying it. And then the corvette flew out the other side, damaged but alive, and its crew let out a sound that the Council's translators could not interpret, but that every human in the galaxy would have recognized as a war cry. The battle lasted 6 hours, and it was not a battle so much as it was an education. The Council fleet had come expecting to crush a frightened and primitive species, and instead they found themselves facing something they had never encountered in all their long history, which was an enemy that could think faster and adapt quicker and fight harder than anything the galaxy had ever produced. Humans were stronger or smarter, but because humans had spent their entire evolutionary history fighting for survival against a planet that had tried to kill them every single day, and that had made them into something the galaxy was not ready for. By the 4th hour, the Council fleet was surrounded. By the 5th hour, their weapons were disabled. By the 6th hour, 11,000 ships had surrendered, and the remaining 4,000 had been allowed to retreat, because Admiral Tanaka gave the order to let them go. And when his officers questioned this decision, he said simply, "We need witnesses." And then came the part that confused the galaxy most of all. The humans did not kill their prisoners. Every captured crew member was treated with medical care and given food and water and shelter, and the wounded were healed and the frightened were reassured, and human soldiers walked through the corridors of captured ships, not with weapons drawn, but with hands open and voices calm, and they said the same thing in every language to every species they encountered. The war is not with you, it is with the ones who sent you here. Simultaneously, across Council space, humanity's hidden assets completed their strikes with the same surgical precision. The Valori Dominion's 3 largest shipyards were disabled by sleeper programs that had been buried in their construction software for 15 years, and the yards did not explode. They simply stopped working. Every system frozen, every assembly line halted, every weapon half-built and useless. The Kreth Concordat's central communication hubs went dark, severed by devices that had been planted in the hub's cooling systems by human engineers who had been hired to install those very systems a decade earlier. And without their hubs, the hive mind could not coordinate across distances, and the great unified intelligence of the Kreth fractured into billions of confused and frightened individuals who had never known what it felt like to think alone. And on Thessera Prime, the Council's capital, the planetary defense grid shut down without a sound, disabled by code that Solace had planted in the system years ago, and 12 human Special Forces operators descended from orbit in a craft so small and so quiet that no one detected them until they were already walking through the corridors of the Grand Tribunal chamber. They carried weapons, but they did not fire them. They walked past guards who dropped their arms and stepped aside, not because they were ordered to, but because they could see in the eyes of these 12 humans something that transcended language and species, a purpose so clear and so absolute that to stand in its way felt like standing in the way of gravity itself. Admiral Tanaka's voice filled every broadcast channel in the galaxy. "We did not choose this war," he said. "We came to you with open hands, and you answered with murder. So hear us now. We do not seek your extinction. We are not you. But the structures that killed our ambassador, the powers that silenced justice, the tyrants who perverted your own laws, their reign ends today." On Thesera Prime, in the Grand Tribunal chamber where Alara Voss had been executed, Zorath Vel sat alone on his throne. His guards had abandoned him one by one as the reports came in, each one worse than the last. His fleet shattered, his shipyards frozen, his allies scattered, his secrets exposed, and now the chamber that had been filled with 4,000 voices was empty, except for him and the sound of his own breathing. The door opened, and a human soldier walked in, a woman with dark eyes and a face that showed no hatred and no triumph and no cruelty, only a quiet and terrible sadness. She walked to the tribunal podium where Zorath had stood when he pronounced Alara's death sentence, and she placed a single object on its surface. Was Ilara's diplomatic credentials, the small metal case with the seal of the United Earth Confederacy, recovered from the execution site where it had been discarded like garbage. The soldier looked up at Zorath Vel sitting on his throne in his empty chamber, with his empire crumbling around him, and she said 5 words. "She came here for peace." Zorath Vel said nothing, because for the first time in his long and powerful life, he had nothing to say. 3 months after the reckoning, the galaxy looked like a house that had been struck by a storm and was slowly learning how to stand again. The Galactic Council was gone, dissolved not by human weapons, but by its own members, who voted one by one to disband the institution that had governed them for 200,000 years, because they had watched the unedited footage of Alara's trial, and they had seen the truth of what their government had become, and they could not unsee it. In its place, something new was being built, and the most remarkable thing about it was that humanity was not building it alone. The proposal came from Admiral Kazuo Tanaka, delivered not from a warship or a bunker, but from a simple podium on Thesera Prime, where he stood in a civilian suit with no medals and no guards, and spoke to representatives of 3,000 species who had gathered to hear what humanity wanted. What they expected was conquest, because that was what every empire before them had promised. Dominant species in galactic history had done when it held the power that humanity now held, and they sat in their seats and waited for the terms of surrender. Instead, Tanaka said something that none of them expected. "We do not want to rule you," he said. "We never wanted to rule you, and we will not start now. Because the moment we become the thing we just defeated, we lose the right to call ourselves human." He proposed a new governing body called the Galactic Accord, built on principles that were simple and clear and non-negotiable. Every species would have an equal voice, regardless of age or military power or territorial size, and no single species or bloc could hold enough votes to override the will of the majority. And the judicial system would be independent of the governing system, so that no one could ever again be both prosecutor and judge. And trials would be open and transparent and subject to review by an independent body. And the use of the axiom of preemptive extinction would be permanently abolished and stricken from every legal document in galactic history. Some species were suspicious, because they had lived under the old system for so long that they could not imagine a new one that did not hide the same corruption beneath a different name. And they asked Tanaka how they could trust humanity not to abuse its power. Tanaka looked at them for a long moment, and then he said, "You watched us win the most decisive military victory in galactic history. And then you watched us heal your wounded, and feed your hungry, and return your captured ships, and let your retreating fleets go home. And if that is not enough to earn your trust, then nothing I say here will be. But I am asking you to try, because Alara Voss believed that this galaxy could be better than it was, and she died for that belief. And I will not let her death mean nothing." The chamber was quiet for a long time, and then the Polani representative stood up. The same timid herbivore species that had failed to defend Alara at her trial, and he spoke in a voice that trembled, but did not break. "We failed your ambassador," he said. "We were given the duty to defend her, and we were too afraid to speak. And that failure will haunt my species for generations. But if you are offering us a chance to be better, then we accept, and we will spend whatever time we have left trying to deserve it." One by one, other species stood and added their voices, and by the end of the session, more than 2,000 had pledged to join the new accord, and the number would grow to over 3,000 in the following weeks. Zorath Vel was put on trial. It was a real trial this time, conducted by independent judges drawn from 47 different species, with full legal representation provided by the best advocates available, and the proceedings were broadcast openly to the galaxy, with every piece of evidence verified by an independent forensic team. Zorath did not deny what he had done, because the evidence was overwhelming, and he was too proud to lie, but he argued that he had acted in the best interests of the galaxy, that humanity was a threat that needed to be contained before it grew too powerful, and that history would vindicate his decision. The judges listened to every word, and then they deliberated for 11 days, and when they returned, their verdict was unanimous. Guilty of judicial corruption, conspiracy to commit murder, fabrication of evidence, abuse of office, and crimes against the Galactic Accord. He was sentenced to permanent exile on a barren moon at the edge of explored space, a place with breathable air and enough resources to sustain life, but nothing else. No technology, no communication, no contact with any other living being, and he would spend the rest of his long Valori life in the company of nothing but the silence and the knowledge of what he had done. Not death, because humanity did not believe in answering death with death. And it was not torture, because humanity did not believe in cruelty, even against those who had been cruel to them. But it was justice, and it was permanent. And when Zorath Vel was led from the chamber for the last time, he looked back at the humans who had judged him, and he saw in their faces not hatred, but something worse, which was pity. The Kreth Concordat underwent a transformation that no one had anticipated. When humanity's strike had severed the hive mind's communication network, the individual Kreth had experienced independent thought for the first time in their species' history. And while many had found it terrifying, others had found it liberating. And when human scientists examined the communication hubs, they discovered something that changed everything. The hubs had been infected with Valori neural parasites for over 600 years, tiny biological organisms that had been secretly influencing the hive mind's decision-making, pushing the Kreth toward alliance with the Valori, and suppressing any thoughts of independence or resistance. Humanity helped the Kreth purge the parasites from their systems, and when the hive mind reconnected, it was different, clearer, and freer, and more genuinely unified than it had been in centuries. And the Kreth formally apologized to humanity and pledged themselves as allies with a sincerity that the galaxy had never seen from them before. A memorial was built in the Grand Tribunal chamber where Alara had died. It was not grand or elaborate, because the humans who designed it believed that the most powerful memorials are the simplest ones. And it was a single block of white stone from Earth, carried across the stars, placed at the exact spot where Alara had stood when the dissolution field took her. And engraved on its surface were her final words. Every species that visited Thesara Prime was required to pass through the chamber, and over time it became a place of pilgrimage, a place where beings from across the galaxy came to stand in the presence of those words, and remember what had happened, and what it had cost, and what it meant. Solace was given a permanent position in the new Accord, not as a voting member, but as an independent observer and guardian of truth, tasked with monitoring every trial and every judicial proceeding to ensure that what had happened to Alara could never happen again. And Solace accepted the role with a simple statement that was broadcast to the galaxy. "I was built to advise Ambassador Voss," Solace said. "I could not save her, but I can honor her, and I will do so by ensuring that the truth is never again something that can be silenced by those in power." Admiral Tanaka retired on a quiet Tuesday, without ceremony, without fanfare, and he returned to a small house on the coast of Japan, where the ocean met the shore and the wind carried the smell of salt. And he sat on his porch and looked at the stars, and he thought about Alara, and about the galaxy, and about what humanity had done, and what it had chosen not to do. A reporter found him there, and asked him for a final statement, and Tanaka thought for a while, and then he said, "We built the Destruction Protocol because we knew the galaxy might fear us, and we hoped we would never use it, but we will never apologize for surviving, because that is the one thing humanity has always known how to do." 6 months after the reckoning, a new human ambassador arrived on Thesara Prime. Her name was Lena Okafor, and she was young, barely 30, with warm brown eyes and a voice that carried the same quiet strength that Alara's had carried. And she had been chosen not because she was a warrior or a strategist, but because she believed with everything she had that the galaxy deserved a second chance. Of Thesara Prime, with the eyes of thousands upon her, species of every shape and size and origin, watching the new human ambassador make her way toward the Grand Tribunal Chamber for the first session of the Galactic Accord. She paused at Alara's memorial. The white stone glowed softly in the chamber's light, and Lena placed her hand on its surface and felt the coolness of it against her skin, and she stood there for a moment in silence while the galaxy held its breath. "We made it, Alara," she whispered. "They are listening now." She lifted her hand and turned, and walked toward the chamber doors, and behind her the memorial stood in its circle of light. And ahead of her, 3,000 species waited to begin the work of building something that had never existed before. A galaxy that was not governed by fear or power or the ancient belief that strength gave you the right to destroy what you did not understand. The doors opened, and Lena Okafor walked through them, and the doors closed behind her, and the galaxy moved forward.